Good evening. We're back here for another video lecture for Philosophy 101. Tonight we're going to kind of hopefully finish up Parfit completely. And in fact, I'm not sure how long it'll take us to do it. There's some other big concepts to get down, but we'll see. And for those of you guys who are in the group chat, definitely room here for questions along the way. And I'd really appreciate that because um, there's some pretty tricky concepts here. Like in totality, Parfit doesn't really have that many moving parts to what he's up to, but the things that are in motion are kind of tricky and, like I was talking about this morning, counterintuitive and unorthodox. So definitely, if you guys are, feel free to interrupt things as the lecture goes along, and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. I think we'll have time for that tonight. We'll see how it goes, but that's how I'm feeling right now. Um, so I wanted to pick up right where we left off this morning in talking about cue memories and what these whole cue memories are supposed to be about. Remember that Parfit has three main claims that are necessary for him getting to deriving his conclusion. His ultimate conclusion, his ultimate position that he's shooting for is that all of the things that we think we need a concept of personal identity in order to understand or have knowledge about can actually be freed from their connection with personal identity. And if that happens, then there's no reason left over of why we should commit ourselves to the belief that there even is such a thing as personal identity. So that there are people, that there are these special types of objects. He's like, we actually don't need that concept at all, and we're better off without it. But the key part of this strategy is him defending the idea that all of the stuff that normally we think we absolutely must have an understanding of identity in order to discuss, things like survival, whether I will survive the death of the body, or issues of especially moral responsibility. That's the big one I'm going to harp on, even though he doesn't talk about it as much. I'll kind of adapt what he has to say to this moral responsibility question too. But basically, all of those kinds of concepts that seem to necessitate a notion of personal identity can actually be talked about and understood and analyzed without any mention of personal identity whatsoever. And his main way of doing this is what I was talking about this morning as the eliminating the middleman strategy. So I'm going to draw on the board again here. We've got, remember, we don't just care about personal identity in a vacuum. There are these other issues that give rise to it, like that. And then because of that, then we need a theory that's supposed to explain personal identity. But Parfit's strategy is to say, well, we don't need this notion of personal identity. We can do away with that concept and just use the stuff that the theories talk about, which in the case of Parfit is mostly the psychological continuity theory. That's the one that he really likes. We can just use those to address those issues and give an analysis of them directly without kind of working through this intermediary of personal identity. So the thing that we left off on this morning was this notion of a cue memory. And a cue memory is very important for this whole strategy because it's a way of talking about these relations, like psychological continuity, in a way that doesn't have to do with personal identity. So let's go back over what Parfit has to say about cue memories. Actually, I'm going to pause for a second because there are some people trying to join up that aren't using the link that I sent out. So I'm going to catch them up and then we'll restart the lecture. All right, we're back. So we got to talk about cue memories. And again, I want to kind of remind you of a little diagram I had from this morning. So we've got this like big category of cue memories. And then within it, that smaller category is what I was calling, like in square quotes, like real memories, but these are really just the memories that we're all familiar with. The kinds of memories we have are all in this kind of category. So they count as cue memories, but there's also cue memories that don't fit in with the things that you and I experience on an everyday basis. And here's the difference here. With a cue memory, it's basically all the things that we're requiring out of an authentic memory. That whole, like, the causal connection has to sync up with the reference of the memory. So the memory experience I have references some other experiential event, and the thing that it's referencing has to be the causal origin of how I'm capable of having the remembering experience. That's still required for a cue memory. It's just there's no requirement that the person who's doing the remembering is the same person as the one who had the experience that's being remembered. So in our cases, all of the real authentic memories we have are the ones that happen to us. I mean, that's in the kind of traditional sense of us here, the normal notion of identity, that, you know, the one that Parfit's really denying. But we're going to talk about that. Like, the only authentic memories I ever have of things that happen to this stream of consciousness. I never really have access to yours, or anyone else's, just my own. But it's possible, it's very conceivable of this sort of situation happening. And the whole Google chip example from this morning is supposed to be an illustration of that. And I got a couple more illustrations too. So let me kind of talk through those next and show you what a cue memory might actually look like, other than the ones that, you know, we're familiar with because they just are in the category of cue memories. You know, if I'm the same person in both the remembering and the original experience, then it's still true that there was someone who had the authentic experience, and the rememberer is connected with that in the proper causal way. But here's some examples of the weirder outlier types. Okay, so again, my example from this morning. Let's say we're able to have we have enough understanding of how the brain works and how memory is encoded that we can basically replicate this with computers. So Google designs a chip that I can put in my brain that kind of expands my memory. It lets me have a much more reliable access point for all of the experiences that ever happen to me. Like, as I'm having experiences, the Google chip is tracking all of those and copying those into memory. And then I can also, I don't just write to the chip, I can also read from the chip. I can pull memories off of the chip the same way that I would with my natural organic memory with my brain. So that's a conceivable sort of thing that might be able to happen. Now, what happens if I can take the chip out and give it to you, or I can take your chip and plug it in, and then access the contents of that chip? In such a case, the direct causal link of why I'm able to have the experience of like calling up that memory and seeing it from like your perspective, because that's what it would definitely be if it's just like, it's like, imagine there's like a camera that's recording everything that's taking place in your experience. When I'm accessing the chip and jumping into those memories, what is allowing me to have the content of that remembering experience is a direct causal link to you originally having that experience. Because if you didn't have that experience, it wouldn't have been encoded on the chip, and when I plugged it in and accessed it, that memory wouldn't be there. But it was. It wasn't like I photoshopped the memory and put it on the Google chip. That'd be a fake remembering. Even it would be a fake cue memory. But as long as that experience was an authentic experience and the Google chip recorded it, and then I'm able to access it because it was preserved in the memory of that Google chip, then that is an authentic memory. The causal link and the reference link sync up. It just so happens that I wasn't the one who had the original experience. The person who's doing the remembering now, me, is not the person who had that experience. But for all other purposes, it meets the conditions of an authentic memory. This kind of example, again, is a way of talking about authentic memories without requiring any kind of judgment of identity. Right? We can still talk about fake memories versus real authentic memories, and I don't have to put any condition there like that the two people have to be the same or something like that. Remember, if the psychological continuity theory originally is using these connections, these memory connections, to make sense of identity, Parfit wants to keep them. He's like, I like the memories thing, but we just don't need to talk about it in terms of explaining identity. We can just deploy them directly to solve issues like survival questions and moral responsibility questions and other things too. For those of you guys in the chat, is that making sense? The whole Google chip example? Do you guys see how that fits the conditions of a cue memory? Cool. Any questions at all?
Why is that's not even like possible, like to do that, to like trade memories like that? So I don't even understand why he's even.
On what grounds do you think it's so impossible?
To take someone, I mean, maybe he gets like pictures and videos nowadays. You can like look at other people's experiences, but like to take someone else's memory and put it in your memory. I guess is that what you're saying? Like you're
Well, I'm giving you a little bit more
uh,
with like this Google chip thing. It's like the brain is like a computer. This is the kind of general idea. Brain is like a computer. If we could understand the biological processes and computations that my brain is up to when it's like storing memory data, right? Then maybe we could replicate that and
yeah.
supplement it with a computerized version of that.
Oh, so that he's just saying that like if we could do this, or I don't know. I'm kind of lost, but
So the idea is
like
that if we could do this, like if you were able to do this, then you wouldn't say, well, that wasn't my experience, so it's a fake memory. You could still say it's an authentic memory. I'm like seeing what happened. It might even be something that could be admissible in court as evidence. It's like eyewitness testimony. The Google chip captured it, sort of thing.
okay,
Does that make sense?
yeah,
It might still be difficult to tell, like Parfit talks about this. If we were having access to Q memories all of the time, then we would start to think differently about our memory seeming experiences. Like the way we are right now, what types of beings we are, not supplemented by technology or like the cyborg sort of thing. The way we are naturally, whenever I have a memory experience, as long as I'm like, yep, that's authentic, then I'm like, that was me. That happened to me. I kind of always make the judgment of identity that connects with that. But imagine, let's say we've got these Google chip sorts of things, and not only are they like recording our experiences, but they also have a wireless built into them, and they're hooked up to the internet. So imagine you're constantly getting like a feed of other people's experiences through the internet connection that are fed into that Google chip that you can access the way you would access normal memories. Now your life just got a lot more confusing because all the memories that you're trying to
yeah,
like uh, access and scan through may not even be yours, but you can't even tell. From the inside, you wouldn't be able to tell. But you maybe would just be able to know that these are authentic memories, or and even that you might not know, but they could still be authentic memories if they're not yours. Does that make more sense, or did I just
uh,
muddy the water?
yeah, yeah. It makes sense, kind of. Yeah,
Okay,
makes enough sense.
okay. I'll give a couple more examples here because I have a couple more examples, and maybe one of these will work a little bit better. I don't know. You tell me. We got another question in the comments here. I'm not sure I'm following, Daniel. Or maybe it's just I can't remember what it was that you were responding to when you wrote the quote or when you put the
So
post up.
in the Q memory, basically survival and personal identity are separate. They're not tied to each other. So am I right?
Um, what we're talking about psychological continuity, we're not talking yet about survival. We haven't done that yet. But what we're talking about with psychological continuity, that's not linked to personal identity. Yes.
Because what I'm saying is, say you take the Google chip of another person, that break from being one person to realizing you're another person remembering somebody else's memories, is that not the break itself right there?
Well, okay. Let's take the standard psychological continuity theory and apply it into the situation, my hypothetical situation of this Google chip technology. According to the theory, technically, that would make me you. I would be the same person as you, as long as I was having authentic rememberings. And maybe that's another reason to think that as a theory of identity, it's just not going to work. Remember, this was Parfit discussing these counterexamples like the Wiggins case and the Heaven twins sorts of things. That if this really is the theory of personal identity, it starts generating some really absurd claims. But that's usually taken to be a reason that the theory is wrong. And Parfit's supposition is that I think that the concept of personal identity is the troublemaker here. That's the thing that's creating all the trouble. It's not that we just have the wrong theory. We've got the right theory. This theory is pointing to us about the stuff that matters for these issues. But just conceived of as a theory for personal identity, it just makes for all this sorts of absurdities. But Parfit thinks again that it's not the theory, it's not like psychological continuity that's responsible for making identity and so confusing. It's really our pre-theoretical concept of personal identity that's causing the trouble. kind of a weird position to have, but this is what he's claiming. Yeah, let's keep going. Okay. It is a little mind blowing. Okay. So here's a couple other examples of Q memories, and I'm taking both of these from Star Trek. And actually, they both come from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which it seemed like most people in the class are unfamiliar with. So I'll lay it all down. Okay, I'm gonna do some more drawing. And actually, perfect. I'm actually going to exploit the actual figures on my T-Rex or my dinosaur comics thing. So we're gonna call T-Rex. Well, okay, let's do it in this one. Let me get some drawings down here. And there's a little reference here for fans of Star Trek.
If my dad was here, he'd get it.
Okay, so let's start with this panel right here. So there's two characters here, Jadzia, Dax, and Cisco. And they know each other. They're like two main characters in the show. But Jadzia actually has a symbiotic life form that lives inside of her, which is this little slug in her belly. Okay? So here's this guy named Curzon Dax. The symbiote lived in Curzon. He was this dude, the guy with I'm giving him sunglasses to distinguish him here. Okay, so there's Curzon. He's the host, and the symbiote is named Dax. And Curzon and Cisco were buddies, like a long time ago. When Dax was in the Curzon host, he knew Cisco. And so Cisco and him, like, they have all these memories together, right? Then Curzon dies. But Curzon's just the host. Dax lives on, and Dax, this little slug thing, gets implanted into Jadzia. So Jadzia now has the Dax symbiote in her, and the way that this is sort of talked about is that the symbiote and the host like share memories. They share consciousness. They're both like experiencing alongside each other in consciousness. So when Jadzia gets the Dax host, she gets access to all of Dax's memories, including the ones that happen to Curzon. So when Curzon and Cisco were hanging out and having fun and all these memory making things, when Jadzia meets Cisco, they talk about the same sort of stuff. They're like, remember we went to that crazy bar and you met that crazy person and did this crazy thing? And they're like, yeah. And in fact, Cisco always refers to Jadzia with the nickname Old Man, even though she's like a young, hot woman, because the Dax was in this dude, Curzon, before, and he was like an old man who was about to die. So this is a weird situation because identity is sort of getting confusing. But when we think about it in terms of Q memories, it's not so confusing. It's actually, we can sort this out pretty well. That Jadzia is not so confused because she's got all these fake memories and she doesn't know what's her and what's not her. She's totally cool with it. She's acclimated at this point because she's just accessing Dax's memories, thinking about them as real, authentic memories. That's how she's like developed a relationship with it, and why this isn't like she's having an existential identity crisis every 5 minutes, because she's kind of negotiated this. There are some episodes that explore some identity crisis stuff, but the basic idea here is that if Jadzia remembers what happened to Curzon, it's a real authentic memory, because the cause of her having this remembering experience here is directly causally linkable to the Dax symbiote, which encoded the experience that happened to the Curzon Dax. Okay? So Jadzia is maybe, I mean, who knows? Is she the same person as Curzon? Well, maybe not. But the memories she's able to access from the Dax symbiote are definitely authentic memories. And that's all required. That's all that's required for a Q memory. just has to be an authentic remembering. The person who's remembering doesn't need to be the same person as the person who had the original experience. Does that make sense? Does that this Dax symbiote thing make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Even better than the Google thing. Well, I kind of like the Google one because it's not so science fiction-y fantastic. But, you know, in principle, one's as good as the other because we're just talking about what's possible here. Okay, I got one more example to talk about, also from Deep Space Nine. Another one of the Deep Space Nine characters is a shapeshifter. They're an alien species that is naturally in a gelatinous liquid form, but they, through their own choices, can make their liquid form take on different physical forms, different solid forms. So he can like turn into a bird and fly and you know go under cracks and doors and crap like that. So and he has a kind of humanoid shape that he usually takes when he's around humans and other people like that. Okay, so now here's the weird thing about this dude's species. The dude's name is actually Odo, by the way, so I'll refer to Odo. Odo was sent out by his race to go off and kind of have experiences separate from the rest of his society to like explore life in other forms. Okay, but at the homeworld of these beings, the changelings, they all live in one big ocean. It's just an ocean of these liquid beings, and they're not really separated from each other. They're just like one big mass. At various points, like you'll see Odo kind of like meld into another changeling. They'll like kind of like join bodies, and it's like the liquid starts flowing. You know, it's kind of crazy. It's implied it's kind of sexual too. Anyway, what happens when they're like sharing liquid forms is they get access to each other's thoughts and memories, and in those cases, they're having authentic Q memories. So here's the ocean of gelatinous goo people. Okay, so they're all together in one big ocean, and then one of them separates off, goes off and has some experiences, and then comes back and rejoins, and now everyone gains the knowledge of their experiences. They get to share in their memories of what happened when they went off. Okay, and when that happens, those people who are like in the jelly ocean thing, they're not the ones who went off and had those experiences, but they're having Q memories of those experiences because their access to the remembering experience that they're currently experiencing is a direct causal link to the being who had the actual experiences, and those were encoded in their memories and then transmitted to them. So it's sort of like the memory was causally preserved from the original experience that is now being remembered. So that makes it an authentic memory. Just so happens that they're not the same people. Person having the experiences who went off to have that experience and the people who are now accessing that memory experience in the present moment are different people. So these are all more examples of Q memories that lie outside the boundary of what are the kinds of things that we are familiar with, where we are the same person, or common sense tells us we are the same person. The person doing the remembering and the experience that's being remembered were had by the same person. Does that help anymore? That Odo shapeshifter liquid people example make sense?
The Dax one made sense. I like the Dax one.
Dax one made sense?
Yeah.
Any other questions about Q memories here? All right. Let's move on then. So, I'll erase all this stuff again. So, what has Parfit accomplished if he's been able to come up with this sensible notion of a Q memory? Well, he wants to say, remember, he wants to eliminate the middleman here between these issues that we care about and the theories like psychological continuity that talk about certain relations, like the relations of memory. Remember, he wants to use this to address these issues directly without having to go with this middleman of personal identity. We're getting that out of the picture. If the notion of a memory, of an authentic memory, relied on personal identity, then he couldn't do this. But by talking about a Q memory, now that we've got the Q memories to work with, now we've been able to liberate from this connection. We've been able to liberate the psychological continuity theory from this concept of personal identity. That's the big deal about Q memories. That's why they matter, theoretically, for Parfit's project. Basically, Parfit wants to argue that when we care about issues like survival, what we really care about are things that admit of degree, that aren't things that are like on-off properties. Remember how we were saying that our pre-theoretical notion of personal identity was that it has this kind of all or nothing, this on-off dynamic. You either are the same person or you're not the same person. There's no in between there. And usually the conflict here was a problem for the psychological continuity theory because, how much, we've been talking about that there is just some connection or there's not a connection. That's the kind of way in which the memory theory is tracking this on-off property. But we could also talk about these relations of memory in terms of their actual substance, like how much connection is there between me and a past version of me. And Parfit thinks that's actually the stuff that matters more for survival. It matters, according to Parfit, that I survive, like a bunch of the things about me stay consistent, or that there's some kind of continuity with. So Parfit would kind of say that, like how much does it matter that that baby picture person, right, that infant version of me is like psychologically continuous with me? Once we get rid of this notion of personal identity, I mean, why would we care about something like that? Maybe we don't. Maybe with survival, it matters to me that these certain aspects of me, the quality stuff, like all the kind of stuff we were talking about, qualitative identity, maybe that's the stuff that really actually does matter when we're talking about survival. So take the Wiggins case where like I'm split into two people. Does it really matter that now there are two and I need to somehow address this thing about identity as being a singular property? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe all that matters is that those things have this like deep connectedness with the person before the split. So the Wiggins case is an example of a type of organism that Parfit is talking about in kind of the second half of the reading, where he's talking about a type of organism that does this fission process that divides. So here's time moving forward, and at some event there's a split. Like I split my brain and put one and two bodies. Now, I'm actually, I think to explain this next part, I want to bring in another issue that we might think requires a notion of identity, but maybe it doesn't. That maybe it can be liberated from that, as Parfit says. And this is the issue of personal relationships. So, we all have personal relationships with people, like life partners, family members, close friends, stuff like this. And the relationships are really defined by the whole story of what happened between you guys through time, right? It's like it matters that this is the person that did this thing in the past, that like we had this sort of moment or shared this experience or something like that. Like the relationship is really defined by those sorts of things. And if I'm talking about like, well, yeah, I know this person or I have a relationship with this person, we might be thinking about it in terms of personal identity. But really, if we ask ourselves, like, what matters in those relationships? Does it matter that it just happened to be the same identity object, or is it really is the substance of that relationship coming from the actual connections that happen from shared memories and stuff like that?
Memories, yeah.
So imagine that we're really close friends. We've got a long history, and then I split my brain. So I do the Wiggins operation, and now I'm these two people. In all the ways that are these like connectedness properties, like the memories and stuff, you could have a relationship with both of those two people. Like at least after the initial split, you'd be like, oh well, crap. Well, now there's two of them, but I have the same connection with both of them. As time goes on, these two different people might start taking on different properties, and they might drift, and maybe this person turns into a person that you're like, nah, you're not really my friend anymore. Or it's not like we can imagine these things happening. But at least at the outset, you would have the same connection with both of these people. So for all the things that matters for the relationship, you probably keep that relationship going. They'd be like, hey, remember when we were doing this stuff back here, like that memory, and you can commiserate about that or whatever. Like all those same connections would apply there. It would just be really weird. It might take some getting used to. But Parfit thinks this is totally sensible. I mean, this is a way that we probably want to respond to that situation. That if there were two of me all of a sudden walking around, you could still be friends with both of me. That relationship might start changing as you're having different experiences with this one versus that one. But at least at the outset, in terms of the relationship that you built with this person, that's not been rendered null and void just because now I've split into two different streams of consciousness. Does that make sense? Any questions there? No? No? Okay. It's still important that the memory experiences that this person has at this point are hooked up to the actual experiences here in the proper way for them to be authentic cue memories. But if those connections are preserved, maybe that preserves everything that we care about here when it comes to things like relationships or, as in the arena that Parfit's mostly applying it to, survival. So it's like, I survived as two people without saying necessarily that I am the same person. All right, Lawrence says something. Yeah, Lawrence, this is an interesting point that you're making. So Lawrence says, this all seems to reflect upon the qualitative identity and how the culmination of what makes up a person is actually what defines identity. But at that point, you could say that your history with the person is actually what defines the identity. I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that last sentence, but I think your intuition is picking up on something significant here. That Parfit is kind of bringing the attention back to the qualitative properties. And this is, or maybe he's not. I mean, this is a kind of a question about it, because he still has the connections of authentic memory. It's not enough that, like, let's say instead of splitting my brain, I just like create a duplicate of me, like I get a robot that looks like me, or maybe I can like brew up some organic clone that's like my same age and everything, and just copy all of my memories into that thing. That still wouldn't seem like I'm having a relationship with that person the way he had a relationship with me. Certainly Parfit's theory doesn't admit of something like that, because that would be a fake connection. That would be just the copying of that information would be what's responsible for the memory experiences. They wouldn't be authentic because they're not being hooked up to the original memories. But I don't know. Maybe he does want to say something like that. This is where there's room to further explore Parfit's theory. There's a few different ways that a few different directions he could take the theory that might result in different ways of treating those scenarios. I think giving a more, well, to say more about it would require a more extensive analysis right now. And I think I might hold off on that, but that might be a good thing to talk about outside of class. Yeah, and maybe I'll just say this at this point. Does it matter that you have certain memories with the person, like the content of those memories for a relationship, or does it matter that you had them with them? That's kind of a question here. I mean, this is in the wheelhouse of what Parfit is trying to debate, because he is trying to address what is significant about these issues that we have questions about, like survival, moral responsibility, or maybe personal relationships. And if the kinds of things that he's talking about here don't adequately address what we're concerned about here, then he won't have a good theory. That will be a blow to his theory. But maybe that's where some further debate will happen. Maybe what Parfit thinks is significant in, like, what are the things that matter in these issues of personal relationships, survival, moral responsibility, are not the things that he says are the things that matter. And then his theory might have, maybe it's possible that you could, that the traditionalist here, the traditional metaphysician, can stick to their guns and say, yeah, actually, Parfit, you can't just get rid of personal identity, because there's something about that concept that's crucial for what we care about. Like the relations of identity itself are intrinsically valuable and significant when we're talking about these other types of connections. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave it at that. There's a can of worms there for us to open up and explore. But I actually want to take this opportunity to kind of take a time out and check back on what's Parfitt's strategy and what is he up to here with his arguments. Like what's sort of the general form of what's taking place here. And to do this, I need to talk about the concept of pragmatism. So one of the things that makes Parfitt's paper so confusing. Sorry, Lawrence. I'm gonna skip. I haven't read the other things that you've said, but maybe we can come back to it after the video lecture or some other time. I definitely want to talk to you more about that. Okay, so one of the things that makes Parfitt's paper confusing is that the whole first part of the paper, he's very clear in how he wants to get rid of this concept of personal identity. He wants to do away with it. And even in his conclusion, that's really what he's emphasizing. That's the main thing he thinks he's accomplished, is defending the view that the concept of personal identity has no practical use to us, no theoretical use even. We can talk about a theory as another practical project we care about. We have theories to be able to explain things, to give an analysis. And he says, you know what? To analyze all the things that we want to analyze, we don't need this concept of identity, so it's lost all its usefulness and it can be discarded. But in the second half of the reading, he talks a lot about sort of recovering some sense of identity. And whenever I talk about this sort of second sense of the concept of identity, I'm going to talk about it as identity. I'm going to use this kind of voice for it, as opposed to, if I just say identity, I mean the robust metaphysical thing that's supposed to exist, which Parfit thinks doesn't exist. And when we're talking about identity, we're just talking about a convenient concept, a pragmatic concept. Pragmatism is this philosophical position that is wider. Remember how the soul theory gets into a broader theory of dualism or idealism. We were talking about that sort of thing. Or how the materialism answer to personal identity is maybe part of a broader philosophical ontological picture of how everything in reality is just physical, that's all there is to reality. Same thing's going on here, that in talking about the concept of identity as a pragmatic concept, it kind of ties in with this bigger project of pragmatism that happens in philosophy. And the broader version of pragmatism basically stands for the idea that we don't really care about truth. Truth is unknowable. Most pragmatists believe that. They're skeptics of some sort. That it's reality, what's really going on in reality is just not something that we have access to. The stuff that we can use as a basis for knowledge is not strong enough for us to actually know what reality is truly like in itself. The only realities we really get are subjective, or there's a bunch of skeptical arguments. We're going to actually talk about this more later in the quarter. However, the pragmatist says that doesn't mean there's no standards of appropriate belief and inappropriate belief. We're used to using the notion of truth as providing that kind of absolute standard, that a belief is appropriate if it's true, and it's inappropriate if it's false. But the pragmatist says, no, we can't do that. That's actually not a standard we can use because we don't have access to it. We don't know what's the truth, so I can't use that to discriminate about what beliefs I ought to have, right? If I just knew they were true, there wouldn't be any discussion. It's kind of part of the point. But we can still talk about which concepts are useful and which ones are not. What beliefs are doing work for us and which ones are not. And pragmatists actually are extremely rationally rigorous when it comes to deciding about what beliefs we ought to have. It's not like, because pragmatism is true, it's a free-for-all and we can believe whatever we want to believe because it works for us or something like that. Actually, in fact, most pragmatists go really strongly in the opposite direction, mostly because of the way in which they might be confused as saying something like, who cares about truth? Believe whatever you want. So pragmatists are really they're really keen on always holding our beliefs accountable to what work they're supposed to do. But at the same time, they don't have any commitments about those beliefs being universally true or something like that. So the pragmatist twist on personal identity is sort of what I think Parfit is up to. He never comes out and says he's a pragmatist about this, but that seems pretty clearly what he is doing when he's talking about identity in the second half of the paper. And where this comes from is when he's talking about these other kinds of organisms that we can imagine existing, like other types of conscious beings that are not like us, that don't work like us, that have something else going on. They're totally conceivable. But he's going to say that the notion of identity that we have, this robust metaphysical notion of identity, just taken as a concept, would not work for them. It works for us. It fits with what kinds of beings we are and what we have to negotiate in making choices and tracking life. But for those kinds of beings, it wouldn't work. Let me first talk about this idea in the context of what happens with us. So it might be like Miller said in the Perry piece, where it's like same body, same soul sort of thing. It's like same body, same identity. Like I just make the judgment of tracking your identity looking at your body, which is pretty much what I do. When I'm taking roll in the morning, I'm looking at your bodies and I'm checking here, present, yes, okay, whatever. And I'm using a concept to do that. Like I've got your name in my grade book, and I'm like, yep, they weren't here last week, or they are here today, or whatever, right? I'm like tracking that sort of thing. Why? Because in order for this whole education thing to work, I mean, I kind of got to do these grades. I got to keep track of what's going on, your participation, that sort of thing. Because I've got those goals, those practical goals, I need to have this concept of identity to track it. And it's more or less something that I consider stable. It's not weird or goofy. And as long as they have the same body, I'm not really concerned about it. I'm like, yep, no problem judging that you are the same person, even though maybe the whole idea of personal identity is like deeply confused, or I don't even know what I'm talking about. I still use this concept to play this very specific functional role. Is that making sense so far? Guys in the chat, this is the stuff I want to definitely get some feedback about. So let me know if it's going, if there's any questions. This also connects with how I was saying earlier, if we had this Google chip and we were like transmitting memories like through an Instagram over the internet onto this Google chip sort of thing, then I'd start getting really confused about like, wait, I'm having a memory experience right now. Is that something that happened to me, or did I get it from the internet, right? I'd be really confused about it. I couldn't just take it for granted that if I'm having a remembering experience, it's something that happened to me. But because of the kinds of beings that we are, seems like we can basically operate that way without getting into trouble. But if we were different types of beings, then we would get into trouble, and we'd be a little more cautious about it. That's another kind of that argument or that observation is pointing out the sensitivity to these kind of like pragmatic features. Okay, no questions so far. All right, I'm going to keep going then. So if we were going to draw the kinds of beings that are us, they'd look like this. They're like parallel streams of consciousness. My stream of consciousness never splits or divides or merges or does anything weird at all. It's just one stream of consciousness that keeps going through life until I die. And maybe past that, who knows, right? But the kinds of beings we are, we work like this. Seems like we work. We'll take it for granted, for the sake of argument, that that is an accurate portrayal of what kinds of beings we are. But we can imagine other things. We can imagine beings that periodically go through these kind of splitting things. So as time is chugging along here, every once in a while, I just like do mitosis, right? It's kind of like a cell that, when a cell reproduces, it's not like it sends part of itself off. It really just splits right down the middle and then like turns into two of them, right? And you couldn't tell like this one's the original one and that's not. They're kind of like, there's just two now. They're like exact copies, that kind of thing. Maybe there's a type of alien organism that's a conscious being. It has sentience, but its biology works that way. That's how it reproduces. It doesn't actually do this sort of sexual reproduction sort of thing or create a new third thing. It just kind of like splits down the middle and makes two of itself. We can imagine that. Beings that were doing that periodically wouldn't be able to use our kind of notion about identity. It wouldn't work for them according to Parfit. Because the kinds of things they'd have to negotiate are different. Because their lifestyle is a different sort of lifestyle, they're going to have a more subtle or more complicated notion of things like survival or identity, this like pragmatic concept of it. They wouldn't be able to do taxes the same way, for example, right? Government's tracking the income you made. It's making judgments about identity in order to do that sort of thing. And taxes for these people would be something much more complicated, right? Because they wouldn't be able to think in terms of that concept. Okay, so a little crazy, but that's Parfit's point. that a notion of personal identity that's singular and one-to-one, it's an all or nothing affair, that kind of concept would not work for beings like this and their particular pragmatic problems of life. What does matter to these beings? Well, Parfit talks about a couple types of options here. Maybe what matters is, he talks about these two different aspects of continuity, what he calls continuity, and what he calls connectedness. So let's look at these beings here. This thing right here, whatever it is, we're not going to say person because we're trying to avoid notions of personal identity, but this thing at this stretch of consciousness right here is continuous with this one back here. And if we keep having it like split even more, right, this thing can trace its continuity all the way back to this thing. But it can't trace it to this thing. They are not continuous. Even though they both came from here, you know, this path branched out this way and this one branched out that way. Make sense? Continuity is like a transitive property. This one's connected, this one's continuous with this one, continuous with this one, continuous with this one. It's like a flowing stream, or like a river that's branching into streams, that kind of thing. Yeah, like a lineage. Yeah. But in a family tree, you are not psychologically continuous with your parents, right? That never happens. You're never merged in consciousness with them and then emerged out of that consciousness stream, at least as far as we know, or that we see all the evidence that we have access to us, or the way we think about that evidence right now. Connectedness is something different. Connectedness is more about like how tight of a connection of like memory relations is there between this thing and this thing. Maybe this thing doesn't look at all like this thing, and in terms of all the qualities, it's not really it doesn't share a lot of properties with this one anymore. It's so far off in the past that it's not very connected. The same way that I'm not very connected with my infant self. There's so many differences there, and I don't remember anything that happened to me back then, right? I'm still continuous with my infant self because there's been that continuous stream of consciousness, but I don't have a lot of access to that person, to that thing, that persona, the infant Tim, because I don't have a lot of memory relations to it and that sort of thing, okay? So Parfit asks a question, and he speculates about it. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but he would say, what would matter to these beings is more a matter of connectedness than continuity. That would be more important for things like questions of, did I survive? Or, you know, am I having a relationship with this person or not? Or who is morally responsible? Like, maybe these people are or these things, whatever, these stretches of consciousness are so far removed from each other that, like, punishing this person for what this person did seems kind of absurd. Maybe that's not what's important here. Maybe it'd be important that they're more psychologically connected if we were going to hold them morally accountable like that. Because psychological connectedness doesn't end with memory for Parfit. He thinks that we can have, just like we can have Q memories, we can have Q other mental phenomenon, like Q intentions. Like an intention is something that is a mental phenomenon that definitely is a big part of my reality. I make an intention right now. I'm like, as soon as this lecture is over, I'm going to get some food because I'm hungry. I haven't done it yet, but I formed the intention now, and if I go and act on it later, then that's a kind of psychological connectedness. My behavior is connected with my intention. And maybe it's the intentions that are really important for moral responsibility. There's a bunch of moral theories that really, most notably Kant's, Immanuel Kant's moral theory, where the intentions are the real key part here of evaluating the morality of someone's behavior. So if the intentions of this person and this person are so different because they're so distant in terms of that continuity, that there's not a lot of connectedness anymore, then maybe holding that person responsible wouldn't make any sense. I mean, that'd be one of the ideas there. So there to be these kind of, we have to make these pragmatic choices about how to understand personal relationships, like maybe even things like marriages, like life partnerships and stuff like that, or things like moral responsibility and holding people accountable for their actions, or these questions of like, will I survive, or did I survive, or something like that. All of these are going to be kind of going to take unique dimensions based on what types of creatures we are. And Parfit thinks that each one of these different types of creatures is really going to have a different notion. This is the next big idea from Parfit. Each of these different types of creatures will construct a new concept of identity, this pragmatic, conventional concept of identity that's just useful for the kinds of problems that they face. We don't, and this is the key thing that Parfit wants to say, we don't need to find some way that the notion of identity that happens for these people needs to in some way be the same as for these people. Parfit thinks the standards could be totally different because we're not holding it accountable to some big, crazy metaphysical reality that's supposed to be the same. It's not this kind of universal metaphysical phenomenon that we're holding the theory captive to anymore. It's just the pragmatic considerations of how to negotiate life for beings like that. That's it. So because these people and these people have different problems, they can come up with different notions of identity that are appropriate because they meet those pragmatic considerations. That's Parfit's big point here in the second half of the article. There's a third type of being that I haven't explained yet. It's a derivative of the ones that split here. He's like, maybe there could also be these beings that not only split, like here's a splitting right there, but that also conjoin. They fuse together. Where there were two streams of consciousness, then there are only one. And I think he gives a lot of special note to this case appropriately because that's even more confounding for our questions of survival. So if these two people merge consciousness, does that mean they both died? That seems really weird because if there's a continuous stream of consciousness, we're like, that's a survival. That counts as survival. It doesn't seem to be that like when Curzon and Dax conjoin, or Jadzia and Dax conjoin, that somehow they've lost their existence. Seems like they still have their existence, even though now they're fused as one stream of consciousness that's so interwoven that you wouldn't be able to separate which part is which part anymore. They're just one agent. That's it. So definitely those kinds of beings are faced with other conceptual difficulties, different pragmatic difficulties, that maybe they'll come up with their own concept of identity in order to solve. Also, Parfit says, you know what? These might not just be alien creatures, but they might be us with enough time in the future. Maybe through advances in technology, or like the brain splitting case is an example of this sort of thing happening. Maybe we'll turn into these types of organisms where these types of realities are things we'll have to face. That's something we can think about now as philosophers. We don't have to wait until it happens to start considering those kinds of philosophical questions. And Parfit's trying to have a way of treating this whole identity question that is going to work for beings like that too. That takes into consideration those circumstances. It's just that Parfit's answer is not the traditional one of saying, well, we have to look at personal identity under all those cases, and there must be some consistent theory over all those circumstances. What Parfit's really proposing here in the second half of the article is that each one of those circumstances might have its own unique answer that fits with the particular demands of those circumstances that are pragmatic, instead of holding the theory accountable to some overarching universal phenomenon that we call personal identity, this personhood object thing. Maybe there is no such thing, and it's just a convenient fiction that helps us negotiate life in the ways that we need to. Okay, that's a lot of Parfit. There's really only one other idea that we might talk about, but I want to take a little break here and check in with the people in the chat room, people who are following in the live stream. How is this going for you? How was that little last like 20 minutes of my lecturing? How'd it go? Got any questions or things you want to ask about?
So this is all explaining like just how we're existing, all of this, what Parfit's talking about, because I understand how like personal identity explains like what we're experiencing, but then like all this memory stuff, and how does that like explain what this is, life, or
what
whatever.
this life that we're in right now is all about?
Yeah, or like who we are, you know? Like we're all just a bunch of memories that just split off from each other, or like from a main memory.
Well, I mean, Parfit doesn't say anything about where we came from or where we're headed, right? He doesn't make any kind of claims about that. He says we are just beings like this right now. That's what seems to be evident to us in direct experience. But we could be beings like this. I mean, who knows? Maybe the underlying story here, like we were talking about some of these other possibilities in class this morning, like the Alan Watts example of like we're all just fragments of God's mind that have forgotten that we're a part of God. So we think that we're separate organisms, but we're really not, or something like that. I mean, maybe that's what's happening. Maybe we all came from one. Maybe we're all like those shapeshifters, that we're all these individual consciousness streams that split off from one big, massive consciousness unity. Maybe. But Parfit's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm not trying to say it's one way or the other here. He's just saying that if those kinds of possible worlds or those types of realities are things that we can think about sensibly, as long as we're not holding them captive to this metaphysical concept of personal identity. The only reality that's taking place here is just streams of consciousness, and they might merge, they might split, who knows? It's all just streams of consciousness. There's not some essential thing that is you, that is always you, as long as you exist. There's nothing that is like necessary to you as an individual thing. If you merged with another consciousness, there would be some survival thing, like life went on, the stream of consciousness continued, but it's not like there's this essence that has like carried with it or something like that.
Okay. Actually, I like Parfit now. I didn't like him before, but now I like him. So
I think he's kind of inspired by Buddhists, because Buddhism is big on this idea of no self, right? That the self is an illusion, that there even is a self is a total illusion. But it's not like the Buddhist is like non-functional. It's like they still make decisions. They think about things and be like, what should I do? You know? So there still is a thing that's acting. There still is a consciousness and that sort of stuff. But they deny that there's some sort of essence that makes me what I am as this individual thing. And that's what makes it kind of confusing, I think, at times. I'm not so sure if I'm completely sold on Parfit's theory. I think there's still some explaining he has to do about certain things. So yeah. Like if you're, for anyone who's watching the lecture or who's in the live stream right now, like if you're just like can't shake this notion that there is some metaphysical identity thing, that like all of Parfit's arguments they're just not working for you. You're not convinced by them. I think it'd be good to try to articulate what is not convincing about it and to like turn it into a robust kind of argument. But I would say right now, my guess is from like, here, I'm a dude. I'm like, from everything I have to say about it, those intuitions that you have are not completely unfounded. And that maybe Parfit still has some more explaining to do to really justify his position. But it's a really interesting proposal. It's a very unique, original idea to like resolve the problem in this sort of way. So, you know,
it helps like it kind of explains, at least I feel like that, like living things are kind of connected one way or another. So I don't know, I can't kind of help explain that, or not explain it, but give it whatever.
Parfit makes room for that kind of thing, and he's interested in entertaining those kinds of possibilities. There are plenty of perspectives out there that see some kind of like deep embedded psychic unity that's going place between all sentient creatures, or maybe even all objects, period. Something like that. Like the Berkeley idealism version of like we're all minds in the mind of God kind of thing. Like maybe at some ultimate level there really isn't this separation of consciousness at all. But there still seems to be a phenomenon of separation of consciousness. So maybe that's the kind of thing that Parfit still needs to explain. I might put it like this. One thing that Parfit, all the arguments in that paper have not really addressed is, if Parfit's right about this, then what makes the concept of personal identity so compelling intuitively? Why did we even come up with the concept in the first place? Where did we get it from? Why do we have such strong, deep-seated intuitions that there's something real here to understand? If it's really all just a fiction, fantasy, illusion thing, or convenient fiction, like a pragmatic concept, where did it really come from? I think Parfit maybe has some of the material in the paper to address that, to give some kind of answer to that. But that might be another answer we'd want from the theory in order to really have it sit comfortably with us. Alexa says, I'm going to start reading some of the comments here in the chat too. Yeah, it's definitely Parfit is considering a lot of what if scenarios, and the reason why I mean stems from the traditional metaphysical way of approaching the question of personal identity. That it's like we have to address those cases. So Parfit's like, okay, and good luck, because you're not going to be able to get a good answer when you get all those crazy cases in the mix. And that's what suggests to Parfit this alternative strategy of maybe there isn't a universal phenomenon of personal identity. Maybe we'll just come up with pragmatic concepts to suit each case and just treat it as this convenient fiction sort of thing. That's I think his inspiration. The last concept comes that I want to maybe talk about with Parfit. We're at an hour though, so I need to cut this off pretty soon. The last concept from Parfit that's maybe worth mentioning is all that stuff he talks about in his conclusion. These are kind of like, I would say they are raw arguments. They are unprocessed. They're certainly not at the level of sophistication and polish that the rest of his arguments in the paper have. They're more, I'd say, teasers of other, they're like proto arguments that could be made. But Parfit thinks there's something else that recommends this theory. That, like, if we get rid of personal identity, that's kind of what he's defending. He's like, we shouldn't think of this thing as really a real thing at all. Maybe another thing that recommends it is that if we get rid of personal identity as a concept that we trade in, like we might trade in this concept of identity, the pragmatic concept, but we're going to know that it's kind of tongue in cheek. You know, it's like, yeah, I'm going to call you the same person, but I know there's no real thing like that. But he thinks if we're not so attached to the robust concept of metaphysical identity, then certain other things fall away, like selfishness, self-centeredness. That's a big one. And he thinks fear of death. If I'm not so worried about, like, if I don't have to deal with these complexities about what happens with survival, then that might make my imminent death of my body less scary. Not completely sold on that. I think he, even in giving up the concept of personal identity, I'm not so sure that the issue of survival is not fraught with some opportunity for fear anyway. There could still be something going on there. But the ego one, I think he's got a really interesting point with. That he thinks if we got rid of the concept of personal identity, then whatever's going on with this stream of consciousness, I would just have to consider as like the consequences of things being good or bad for it, in the same way that I think about any other person. That, like, kind of where he's getting some purchase on this idea is, think about your future self. Like, you make choices most of the time. When you make selfish choices, I mean, sometimes it's for something that's going to happen immediately to you right now, but more often than not, it's about things that are going to happen in the future. They're like, I'm going to do this action now because it'll benefit me in the future. It's going to help me in the future. And the future self, I mean, if you don't have any notion that, like, that thing is me, if that connection is broken, and there's no way to kind of talk in those terms, then I have to consider that future consciousness thing as really just another person, like you're a different person than me. Like, to the person I'm talking to, all the students in the class, like, you guys are another streams of consciousness is that are not necessarily me. Or, like, who knows, maybe you are me, who doesn't know, doesn't. Once I get rid of personal identity, there's nothing that makes my relationship with you any different from me to my future self, at least in the terms of stuff that might matter for ethics. There still is a consciousness that will be affected by this action. That's a tricky little argument there. There's something about that I kind of like, um, because I do, and ethics is kind of my main bag here, and I think under analysis there really isn't any good rational argument to defend why what matters to me is somehow more significant than what happens to you. And maybe Parfit's analysis of identity kind of reveals another aspect of why that is true. This whole, like, relation to future selves thing is kind of arbitrary. So I think that's kind of an interesting little note. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to talk about Parfit for the video lecture. But if you guys have some questions, maybe we can close off with entertaining a few questions or clarifying issues, anything like that. Oh yeah, code word. Forgot about code word. Okay, the code word tonight is defiant. Close. Defiant is the code word. All right. Any other questions you guys have?
Okay, since nobody else is speaking up, I got one thing. You were talking about Q memories and Q intentions and Q everything else, and I see where you're coming from. I had a slightly different take on that, that he was using those in the same way he was using memories and connectedness and all that in degrees. To me, you drew this little circle inside of a circle to represent it.
Yeah.
And I think he was more trying to introduce it in a different way. We think of memories as being either false or real, so it's an on-off switch again. And he was saying that Q memories are a way to explain how they could be degrees in between. You could have a memory and that happened to a previous self, and it's partially true because it didn't happen to you specifically, but it did happen to you, and it's 95% real, as opposed to just plain false.
I think that this is a mischaracterization of Parfit's position. That Parfit does not think that the distinction between authentic memories and fake memories is something that admits of degrees. There either is that causal connection or not. This little division right here that you're referring to, the like distinction between the kinds of memories that we're familiar with, where we. Oh, can you mute your microphone, Rob? We're getting some echo. Thanks. The distinction here is also not one that admits of degrees either. The section in here is not real memories and somehow Q memories are fake or something like that. Q memories and the memories we're familiar with, our memories, the kinds of things that the Q memories that we have, where we are the same stream of consciousness that, like remembered and had the original experience and is doing the remembering. Fake memories are all outside this bubble. So any fake memory is like there's a sharp line there. That's at least how Parfit is conceiving of his own theory. You might make up some other kind of theory that does that, but whether there's that causal connection or not, I'm not sure how that could be the kind of thing that would admit of degrees. Either the causal link is traceable back to the original experience or it's not.
Okay, I did see it as that, and I'm not saying I'm right, you're wrong. I'm definitely not. I was asking a question.
Mhm.
But there is a couple of points that still, even with your input there, make me think that maybe he was saying that there are degrees to, if not, he keeps using the term degrees or with other parts of his argument.
That's right.
When he was talking about the branching, he was saying, the relationship and the memories and everything were, with each breaking, each generation, a little bit less of survival for the one before. But the memories, he also alluded to them being slightly less because they're getting further and further from the original causal part. They're still valid, but generation 2 would remember those memories a little more clearly and associate them more connectedly than generation 30. So that and a couple of other things he said were where I was drawing that Q memories could be degrees of memory. Yes, they're true in the fact that they have to meet his requirements, but how well and how directly they relate to you could be degrees.
Well, and this is something I think Parfit he offers some speculation about, but again, he's not kind of giving the final word about it. He leaves it kind of open that we can discuss what sort of factors are going to be important for this pragmatic concept of identity that these beings will have. Whether it's something like continuity, which is an on-off type of property. If something's continuous or not continuous, that would either be the same or not the same. Or it's something like connectedness, which does admit of degrees. Which one of those is relevant for the concept of survival or personal relationships or moral responsibility or any of those issues things, the things I was calling issues? Whether it's the on-off kind of stuff or the admitting of degrees, he kind of leaves that open. He thinks it's going to come down to a matter of degrees, like connectedness. But it might depend on the case. I mean, he's kind of opening up a new space for more philosophical debate and discussion of like, if we really were beings like that, how would we deal with the pragmatic concept of identity? But when it comes down to the distinction between real and fake memories, or the difference between Q memories and the kind of Q memories we have, where we are the same person or something like that, those are supposed to be sharply defined.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of articulates it very well from what I was reading and understanding.
Cool. Anything else I can clarify, you guys?
What was the code?
Defiant.
Okay.
All right. Looks like there's some questions you want to wait until after the recording is over. So maybe I will sign off on this installment of the video lecture, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Bye.